Okay, welcome to our CEO Circle. Today, I'm joined by Arcview's incredible alliance partner, Waterton Partners. Our CEO Circles are a great chance to learn more about the ever-changing cannabis industry and reliable resources that make this industry a success, companies like Waterton. This will be a one-on-one interview with Waterton CEO John Ripley to learn about his story, his challenges, his successes, and all that he has learned along the way. But before I begin, let me reacquaint you with the Arcview Group. The Arcview Group is an event management and financial services firm that leverages its thought leadership through programs and its services to facilitate growth in the cannabis, psychedelics, and industrial hemp industries. We're committed to the social mission, the regulatory evolution, as well as the economic growth of these industries, as in our view, all three are codependent. We operate 4 subsidiaries at the Arcview Group and soon a 5th. Arcview Capital, our FINRA registered broker-dealer, providing investment banking services and now offering a crowdfunding infrastructure. Arcview Consulting, a capable team standing at the ready for those of you who are in the cannabis license pursuit and those seeking growth strategy services. Arcview Ventures, our principal investing group that Gene Sullivan and I run, which includes the Arcview Collective Fund. We've made 20 investments and have 75 investors in that fund, and it's a member managed fund, meaning those investors determine the direction and vote on the companies that the fund actually funds. We welcome you to reach out to us if you have a company that you would like for us to review. And Arcview Events and Experiences, our joint venture with McVeigh Global Meeting and Events to relaunch and create scale for our in-person event business. They also manage our digital program, and they operate our Women's Inclusion Network, which provides a platform for women in the industry to network, collaborate, and support each other and help each other participate in the industry. And I'm pleased to announce that we are back live, and we'll be producing our first Arcview Access Investor Forum since COVID in New York, October 19th through 21st. Please come and learn from the best investors, regulators, thought leaders. Go to our site, www.arcviewgroup.com to register. This event group, by the way, also produces our digital content, our town halls, where we explore the nuances of the cannabis programs on a state-by-state basis, our Arcview Access series, where we explore topics that are important to the industry, and the CEO Circles, where we explore the war and peace stories of C-level execs and entrepreneurs like today. So now with that, let me welcome John Ripley, CEO of Waterton Partners, to the stage. Hi, John.
Hi, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. So let's start, just, sort of in your own words, tell us a bit about yourself, kind of how you got into this industry, and a little bit about Waterton's services.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was a little bit hard to avoid getting involved in the industry. I've been involved in the Denver-based startup community since about 2008, and have been doing startups since then and working with high growth companies since then. I started Waterton Partners in 2012 and have been supporting high growth companies as a consultant in the finance and accounting services area and strategic growth areas since then. And so being involved in that community in Denver, Colorado was the hub of cannabis. It was actually hard to avoid. I don't know that I ever made a conscious decision to become involved, other than knowing that a lot of the other financial services and accounting services firms early on made conscious decisions not to be involved with cannabis. So it was a great opportunity. I had a lot of friends that were involved in the industry, and so it was a natural fit for me and my team and our services that we provide.
So it sounds like a lot of that was just driven by regional demand. You were in one of the first or the first licensed state to
exactly
correct. So it kind of came your way. It's great. So maybe tell us a little bit about the scope of Waterton services. I know you do everything from bookkeeping to fractional CFO work. Why don't you just sort of lay out what kinds of services you can provide to clients in the space?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the best way to think about it is full stack finance and accounting services, as well as some HR services as well. So everything from day-to-day bookkeeping, keeping the books clean, invoicing your customers, collecting on those invoices, managing AP, all the way through controllership, which is, creating policies and processes around financial controls, managing your tax situation, and then up to strategic financial initiatives in the CFO services area, which would include fundraise, mergers and acquisitions. If a founder or a team is looking for an exit, that's really where we can support and help play in those as well.
Yeah, that's great. So, you're a little bit unique from some of the other fractional services because you have this whole HR administration piece. Why don't you talk about that just for a minute? Give a sense for what the scope there is.
Yeah, absolutely. So my background is very heavy in strategic finance, but also in operations as well. And so I've managed HR and IT and various other back office teams. And so I thought this was a good opportunity to bring more of a holistic back office type of service offering to early stage companies who may or may not need, or typically don't need, a full-time HR staff or don't need a full-time finance and accounting staff, but they still need the work to be done. And so in the HR space, it goes all the way from tactical HR work of building handbooks, policies and procedures, building an onboarding type of procedure, through more strategic people planning and resource planning and strategy on the higher end.
Understood. So when you engage with a company, how does it kind of start? What kind of assessment do you do? Do you sort of look at the financial ops that they have and how you can come in and take over, or you sort of do an assessment on what you think they need? How does that sort of initial assessment and onboarding work? What does it look like?
Yeah, it really starts with what the client is trying to accomplish, right? Not necessarily where they are today, but where they're trying to go. We have to understand that first before we can design the back office to support them to get there. For example, if they're going out for a fundraise, that really dictates our work. We have to make sure their books are clean. We have to make sure their data room is prepared, their pitch deck and financial model are up to date, and they're really ready to go out for a substantial fundraise. If they've just raised capital and are looking to execute on that capital, that's a different type of approach, right? So it really depends on what they're trying to accomplish and why they're bringing us in first. From there, we typically do about a 2 to 3 month deep dive on all of their books and financials, everything from their accounting system, their HR processes. Depending on the type of company, it may go into, have they filed taxes, or do they have inventory, and is that up to date and clean? So it really depends on the type of client it is as well. But ultimately, it's about a 2 to 3 month deep dive, and then we come out of that 2 to 3 months with a program that can be maintained going forward. And our clients are long-term clients. We typically look for, we don't do project-based work. So we don't come in and just do 2 to 3 months of full-time work to get your books cleaned up and then send you on your way. We actually engage with clients to be part of their team, to be just like if they had a full-time finance and accounting team. And so our relationships are substantially longer term. So after that 2 to 3 month deep dive, we come out of that with a plan to then maintain and execute on whatever it is that they're trying to accomplish with to get that cleanup and get that maintenance done.
Got it. It goes both ways, right? So you sort of interview the client, you do an assessment, you figure out what they need. But clients should probably do the same thing as they're sort of interviewing. I mean, they're a really important function within operating companies, right? So what are some of the things that companies should think about when looking at a fractional firm to ensure that it's a good fit?
Yeah, great question. Where I'll start is, it's the exact same when you're looking for a true fractional like we are. We're not staff augmentation. We don't do projects. So we're looking to build a long-term relationship with our clients. So from that perspective, my suggestion is, it's not any different than if you were hiring full-time. You want to make sure that they're a culture fit. You want to make sure that their skill set meets the needs that you have. And you want to make sure that they can take you to the next level, just like a full-time hire would be, whether that's connections to others in the industry that you want to get connections to, partnership building, having experience or connections in the investment space if your fundraising is really, really important. So if you're hiring a true fractional, that would be my suggestion. But I think it really starts with what are you imagining the work to be done? So again, we have partners that we work with that do that project-based work. And if you're just looking for a 3-month full-time person to come in and maybe clean up your books or do a deep dive forensic audit or a reconciliation, there are other companies that we can recommend you to that would be perfect for that. But if you're looking to grow and continue to grow and build out a long-term relationship, that's where Waterton Partners plays.
Understood. And a lot of small companies are sort of just driven by day to day. They're driven by just staying alive. And they don't necessarily have a good lens on strategy. You talked a lot about strategy so far. So do you feel that strategy and company goals sort of often get overlooked during, when you're sort of transitioning from that early survival stage into sort of the growth phase? And, what's important to sort of driving targeted success, with a strategy overlay as it relates to the finance function there?
Yeah, so we do a lot of work. So I'll take the last part first, which is how does it overlay to the finance function? We do a lot of work around building dashboards, establishing financial milestones for the company to accomplish, depending on what they're trying to accomplish. Again, if they're fundraising, that's different from if they've just raised funds and are looking to execute on those funds. But we do a lot of work to help that reporting and structure behind that to establish those milestones. To your first question, do companies overlook that? I'm not sure that companies necessarily overlook the establishment of strategy and goals. I think where companies in a high growth area tend to fall down is the revisiting of those and managing those long term to make sure that they're executing against those. It's fairly, many of the founders and CEOs and COOs in every industry at the early stage sit down and say, this is our strategy, this is what we're trying to accomplish, here's our long-term goals. Where they typically don't work is to come back and go, okay, if we're trying to accomplish X, Y, and Z in 5 years, what does that mean for 3 years? What does that mean for 2 years? What does that mean for 1 year and every quarter in this year? And we do a lot of work to help guide that as well, so that we can establish a pathway to that success and execution. The other area that I think maybe they do fall, that companies typically fall down in, or I've seen companies fall down in, is the engagement of a broader team into that strategy and goal setting and execution conversation. And oftentimes the reason for that is because there's a lack of balance in the growth of the company. Many of the companies that we've worked with have focused on whatever the founder's real true experience and skill set is, typically is where an early stage founder will build their team. So if that early stage founder is a technologist or a salesperson, they're going to build a really good technology team, or they're going to build a really good sales team. But to be a sustainable growth company, you have to have balance in that hiring, and you can't ignore, if you build a technology team, you have to make sure that you're building a support and implementation team. If you build a sales team, you have to make sure that you're building a customer success team to make sure those customers are happy, right? And so making sure that the plan includes that balance is really important to successful growth, not just short-term growth.
Yeah, it sounds like you're a little bit of the CEO whisperer here. And clearly from that answer, I can tell you have a good background in tech.
I do, yeah.
Yeah, a lot of early stage companies are so focused, if sort of putting on my tech lens, are so focused on just getting that product out, getting to product market fit, that they forego detail and finance ops. What are the challenges that you see that these sort of earlier seed stage companies have in sort of administering financial operations, right at the outset, and maybe firms like yours are the answer, but what are the challenges? Just they don't have enough time in the day. They figure, let me get the product out, let me get my first 10 paying customers, and it'll be a mess, but we'll play cleanup later. Like, how do they think about it? What are the challenges that they have in sort of just dealing with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say there's really sort of 3 categories. The first category is those founders that value finance ops and get it established from the beginning and have somebody that they value to help build that, that's great, perfect. The other category is the startup founder who's super scrappy, and lives the startup life so that they wear multiple hats, right? Very early stage, they're running HR, they're running finance, they're running sales, and they're developing the strategy and product strategy long term for the company. But there's absolutely a point early on where that founder's skill set is substantially more valuable in one of those other areas, and having them realize that, hey, you should use somebody else to do your day-to-day bookkeeping and your financial modeling and reporting so that you can spend time actually building the value of the company. The true value is that growth strategy. The true value is where you're going, not this day-to-day and month-to-month finance and accounting piece. And so having a founder wake up and realize, hey, I actually need 100% of my time on this strategic execution piece. I need some help in finance and accounting. That's a great area for us because typically they are very smart. They've done a lot of that work. And we just come in and pick it up and support them to their long-term growth. And then the third category is sort of what you mentioned, which is they don't value it to begin with, or they don't maybe realize how much work needs to be done there. And there's a substantial amount of cleanup that comes in. And the biggest challenges for us are just making sure that the data that's needed to provide a cleanup is there. Do you have clean bank records that we could rebuild your financials based off of? Do you have a finance and accounting system? Oftentimes companies, early stage companies they don't go and get a QuickBooks or a Xero or
which is
any other
shocking
accounting
because
system.
QuickBooks is so ubiquitous and so for many easy to set up, even
It
though I
is,
have
and
QuickBooks, but
well, obviously we work a lot with QuickBooks. Most early stage companies are on QuickBooks. Xero is another great one to look into if you're looking for a system. And so, yeah, they I don't know, they just seem to not necessarily value it at the earlier stage. But that's not the end of the world. There are very few cases that I've seen in my experience where it can't be fixed, right? So if you're a year, 2 years into your company and you haven't necessarily focused on that, we can come in and fix it. Now it's going to be a lot harder than if there was some sort of management there before, but it can be fixed generally. Obviously, I think as you're looking towards greater milestones, whether that's launching a product to market, fundraising, going through M&A, any sort of larger strategic initiative, you have to make sure that your books are clean and ready to go for whatever that initiative is. So plan for that ahead of time.
understood. I want to ask some cannabis specific questions. Before I do, I've got one more just sort of general on sort of how companies engage with fractional services like yours. At what point do you think it's time for a company to start to bring in that function full time? And I'm pretty sure the answer is not going to be some binary dollar amount because the complexity of generating a dollar revenue is different for different companies. If you're an enterprise software company and you're doing 150K annual engagements per client, that's very different than getting 150K for 50 clients, which takes a lot more work, a lot more posting in the GL. But generally, how do you think about transitioning away from fractional services into full-time and when one should be thinking about that?
Yeah. So so for us, and as a true partner and as a true long-term solution for companies, that's great for us. What our ultimate goal with our clients is to come in, satisfy their needs for now, support their growth to the point at which they are ready to hire a full-time team. That typically starts at the bookkeeper level or the day-to-day administrative level, and then goes up further into the fractional CFO services, being replaced by a full-time CFO. And the reason for that is because the administrative work tends to grow faster than the need for a full-time CFO. But that's not always the case. Sometimes it flips, and depending on what the company does and what they need, then a full-time CFO comes first. And to your point, there's not really a watermark that says, okay, when you reach, $10 million a year in revenue, you need a full-time CFO. It really comes down to the complexity of the business and what you're ultimately trying to accomplish. And I think the other component of that is the skill set of the rest of the team. So we work with a lot of companies that are fundraising, for example, but typically within those companies, the CEO and the COO or whomever, the CTO, whomever else is on the executive team have experience fundraising. So being a fractional CFO with experience fundraising and connections, that works well because you have to have a team going at it. Now, if it's a company that's maybe raising a growth stage of capital and they bootstrap their way there and nobody else on the executive team has fundraise experience, we're probably going to tell them, you need to go and hire somebody full-time that has fundraise experience, because fundraising, especially now, is a full-time job, and it takes, the pathway there as of today is pretty extended. So, that it really depends again on what they're trying to accomplish and the makeup of the rest of the team.
Understood. All right, shifting gears to cannabis. Within your cannabis portfolio, what kinds of specific challenges do clients that you have faced? And maybe you could give some examples about how Waterton has helped.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a lot of it, I mentioned already the balance of the team, right? We work with a lot of clients in the cannabis space who have built, so our cannabis portfolio is made up primarily of ancillary providers. So whether that's service or technology, or platforms for the cannabis space, the vast majority of our portfolio consists of those, mostly because the team's vast majority of experience is in technology and services, and that's where we work. But we do have a couple of plant touching companies as well. So I'll speak specifically to the sort of ancillary service providers, and I think that's the main thing is that balance, knowing when to hire various different skill sets to continue to support your growth. You don't have to build a 20-person technology team, but if you build a 20-person sales team, you should invest in technology, right? And you should invest in the developers. And so creating that balance and that plan is where we work initially. And then, as I mentioned, we work with a lot of companies that are going through either fundraise or mergers and acquisitions, whether they're being acquired or they're trying to acquire somebody else. And so helping make sure that they're clean, but their strategy for execution of that is really important. And my background is typically on the execution side. So it's really easy to acquire a company. It's a lot harder to make that acquisition successful long-term, how to execute on that acquisition, how to integrate the cultures, how to make sure the strategies and the sales teams and the go-to-market is aligned and all of those sorts of things. So we support our companies and focus almost more on that execution, the post-acquisition, the post-fundraise acquisition, than we do actually getting the acquisition done.
Ah, I see. So that's an important skill set, and that's really where rubber meets the road. Many acquisitions that fail because they don't nail post-closing integration well. But that said, and I wrote a blog post about this many years ago. I was a chairman of a tech company. Company got acquired. We were 3 weeks into the exchange of documents. This certainly is pre-closing, right? So we didn't have the luxury of integration problems yet. And I looked at the legal bill, something like $250,000, and I was like, what, already? Like, I couldn't understand why it was so much. And so I did a little analysis, and I learned that there were so many things the company could have done to be acquisition ready. One example was because you have a whole HR piece, right? Every employment agreement was different. They were not categorized by manager level, director level, with maybe 1 or 2 changes. They were all over the map. So each one had to be vetted and organized, and same with each capital raise. So I often think about, and what I wrote about in that post, of just some of the high level things companies can do that's not too disruptive early in their tenure to be acquisition ready. What do you think about that? What are some of the things that you think about that can help companies maybe be ready and not have to look at a $500K legal bill to do a simple transaction?
The first thing that comes to mind is pay your taxes. right? I'm sure you've seen, Jeff, a number of acquisitions that go sideways because a company hasn't paid their sales tax or hasn't filed their tax returns. Sales tax is a big one, right? And investors will actually look at that as well to make sure that they don't have to do a carve out of the funds to get you caught up on your sales tax. So number one is pay your taxes. Number two is the documentation. You mentioned the employee contracts. That's very, very important. We also check and standardize customer contracts and make sure that the customer agreements are updated, vetted. There's nothing sort of squirrely in the payment language or the term of the contract. There can be some variance there with companies that we work with, but there can also be some easy tweaks there that change the perspective and the valuation of your company and your customer contracts that are fairly easy to execute. And the other one is board documentation. If you have a board, you mentioned the capital documentation, but if you have a board, making sure that those board minutes are documented, making sure that decisions are documented and they're all updated and stored in a data room or on your SharePoint or Dropbox or whatever it is that you use in your company. So I would say taxes and documentation are probably the two things that are the most important to getting yourself acquisition ready. Now, obviously, there's a whole lot of strategy that comes into that, right? The more you can grow, the faster you can grow, the longer you can keep your customers, or the happier. And if you're a dispensary, for example, having return customers that are happy, having brands and suppliers that are giving you your supplies on time. All of those sorts of things obviously are really important to an acquisition, but from the administrative perspective, those are the two things that I would say are top of the list is taxes and documentation.
Yeah, in this case, it wasn't taxes, but it was 100% documentation of all of that board meeting minutes and all of those things, and even some cap tables that didn't seem to sort of line up properly over time. All right, shifting gears back to cannabis. What's going on? And what's your read of the current market? I mean, the public stocks are down 60%. They've already rebounded 20% from their lows. I think there was a lot of optimism when Biden took office. The Dems took control of the House and Senate, that we would be on a steady march to descheduling. That has not happened. The wind is out of the sails. What's your current read?
Yeah. I was one of the few who was not necessarily as excited as everybody else about descheduling when Biden got elected. I mean, I feel like he was pretty clear about his perspective on cannabis when he was elected. I would say the opportunity has probably increased substantially with the recession and the fact that, we always talk about the amount of tax revenue that cannabis as a legal industry generates. And that's what states have noticed and taken the benefit of. And I think it's only a matter of time before the federal government realizes that and notices that they're missing the boat on that tax revenue as well. I would say first and foremost, I think safe banking is probably the one that's going to pass first, in my opinion. And then along with that, probably some form of descheduling. But I think for the foreseeable future, the industry should plan on operating on a state-by-state basis. I'm also hopeful that we see some interstate agreements that can open up interstate commerce as opposed to maybe true national deregulation or regulation and descheduling. But overall, I think the industry is in an interesting spot. I really enjoyed the Forbes article that talked about the complexities around regulation and taxation and how those are impacting the industry. I don't think anything is happening there is gonna change there, but I do think that was good to shed light on the challenges that the industry faces from a legal compliant operating path going forward. And I think we're in an interesting spot right now, other than New York and New Jersey and obviously Texas, which is probably never going to legalize cannabis, but most of the big states are now legal, right? And so cannabis as an industry really went through all of the substantial growth since Colorado legalized, California legalized, Oregon and Washington, Michigan. I mean, you have all of the now Florida is on that path. So you have all of the bigger, most populous states that are not necessarily oversaturated, but they're launched, right? And so kind of the last big one to fall is New York and New Jersey, which I think is going to be really interesting. But the booming growth years of the industry have sort of saturated a little bit, or not necessarily plateaued, but I think saturated. And so what you're seeing now in the industry is a lot of M&A. You're seeing a lot of companies that are struggling to continue to hit their growth goals, struggling to grow to a point where venture investors are interested in putting money in. And so we're just entering the next sort of phase of maturity. And I know we'll figure it out. I love cannabis as a space. I think the industry is very, very scrappy. We exist because of the scrappiness of the leaders of the industry. But I do think that we've entered that next phase of maturity where we have to figure out really now how to be really true businesses and not rely on that growth to continue to pay our bills. We have to figure out how to operate with as much profitability and cash flow positivity as we possibly can.
Yeah, I think that's right on a state by state basis. I think, still what should be a $28 billion industry this year, depending on who you want to, whose forecast you want to look at. Consensus around 73, 75 by 2030. Still a lot of growth in front, but in new states operationalizing and growing, and certainly some of the existing states, are going to see that you're right. There's a level of maturity that means they have to really focus on optimizing operations, whereas they didn't have to do that before. So I get all that. What about the capital markets? Funding is in a lull. Seems to be a big supply imbalance. So we used to notice the supply and demand imbalance for capital at the seed stage, where our fund at Arcview focuses. We're more focused on seed and early growth, but that now seems to be evidence all the way up the stack to growth capital, debt, and later stage capital. That supply and demand balance is really creating an issue. With this in a lull, it's harder for companies to raise their follow-on round, right? They got to get more runway. They got to operate differently. They've got to sort of, when they raise, they have to sort of think forward what their inflection point will be so that they can start a new raise and do that 9 months before they actually run out of money, because it could take that long. What are some of the other strategies that companies can do to sort of stretch their runway and sort of deal with this imbalance or this lull in the capital markets?
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned a bunch of key points. I mean, I think in the cannabis industry, we've had a challenge with sort of that missing middle investor for a while, where 2016, 17, 18, 19, when it really started taking off, we had early stage investment and we had late stage investment, but we had maybe a little bit of a softening in the sort of Series A plus to Series B to B plus range. And I think you're right, that's sort of extended beyond into the other stages. But also I think we're at a stage right now where the initial investors, the sort of people that were in early supporting the building of the foundation of the industry are for the most part still around, but maybe a little bit challenged with the economy and raising additional funds, whether if they're raising a new fund, trying to find new limited partners, trying to get more dry powder into their coffers. We've seen some challenge with those. So even if you are a company that has a very supportive investor, you have to realize that they may not have the dry powder to support you financially, but they will be able, they should still support you emotionally in every other way, right? So, and then we have this other group of investors that started to come into the industry really maybe 2 or 3 years ago, maybe a little bit more than that, who are sort of traditional industry investors, family offices, things like that. And it's really taken them, just like everybody else outside the industry, it's really taken them time to figure out the industry and understand the industry. If I'm a traditional software investor in Silicon Valley and I'm investing in those tech companies, I have to understand that the tech companies in cannabis are going to be completely different, right? And I think that growth, or a CPG company is probably a better, CPG investor is probably a better example. If I invest in CPG, consumer packaged goods, traditional consumer packaged goods, and I want to be in cannabis, it's going that learning curve is going to be very substantial. But we're starting to see that those investors picking up, and so, I think the while we're in a challenging period right now, and we probably will be for the next, call it 12 to 18 months as we work through these economic issues, I think the long-term investment space in cannabis is probably better now than it ever really has been, because you have more players, you have more notoriety, and more people trying to get into the industry from an investment perspective.
Yeah, no, that's right. Somebody said at the beginning, that's very interesting. I don't, and I think this is often overlooked when you're choosing a fund, to think about where those general partners are in the lifespan of that fund.
Mm-hmm.
Is it at the end of their investment horizon before they start their harvesting period, such that there may not be enough follow-on capital, and there could be pressure to exit when you're not ready, so that they can evidence a return to go out and raise their next fund? I'm not sure entrepreneurs think about, because they're so laser focused on getting anything in the door in this particular sort of capital markets environment. But it's really important to understand the lifespan of the fund that you may actually engage with, and that will sort of foretell how they're going to deal with you as a portfolio company. And I think that's a pretty intuitive sort of thing that you said there, because I think that's often overlooked.
I think it is overlooked a lot. And we, the people that I work with, whether they're clients or not, somebody asks for advice in closing a round. I highlight that specifically. Look, you're getting married to this investor long-term, right? This is no different than a marriage. So you have to ensure that your long-term goals align to their long-term goals. What you just mentioned is, if they're going to push you for an exit in 3 to 5 years, you need to at least know that up front. The other thing that I think is really important when you're seeking an investor is make sure, I always say, make sure that the investor can provide you more than just capital. Capital is great, but if they can provide you introductions to others in the industry, if they can help you find a full-time CTO that you need, those things are really, really important. And that's what I talk about when support goes beyond just the funding of your company. If they're just going to put capital in and require you to send them monthly or quarterly financials and take a board seat and not really be supportive of your growth, know that. I'm not saying turn that down, but at least know that going in. But the real, true, valuable investment partners are the ones that will put the money in, require your quarterly financials, take a board seat, but then also help you actually grow, make those introductions to people that you need to know, help you network, help develop your company beyond where you are today.
Understood. So we're running out of time, but I've got 1 or 2 more things to ask you. So this, I'll geek out a little bit. When I was 24, this was before Excel. So it was back in the days of Lotus 1-2-3, and there weren't all of these sort of fancy templates with which you could build a spreadsheet-based operating model to build your assumptions, your income statement, your balance sheet, and your cash flow. And I remember locking myself in my office at 24 years old. I had, a sense for accounting, but I'd never done it before. And I had to build my own model from scratch. I had to think about, okay, if that's ending cash, I got to get that on the balance sheet on the second scale. And I had to build it. Today, they're all built for you. But how important do you think an extensible Excel operating model is to, as you grow and scale a company? And what are sort of the best practices in designing that? I've seen them all. So because of that experience, I've just sort of always been focused on good ones versus bad ones. But ones, to me at least, ones that have a real extensible separated assumption sheet, where you can continually change them and then see the effect through income statement, cash flow, and balance sheet, so you can better have a lens to operate the business. But are there any sort of best practices or sort of design attributes that stand out for you or that you do for clients?
Yeah, exactly that. I mean, let me start out by saying, no matter how extensive your model is, and no matter how good it is, and how far out in the future it is, it's wrong, right? It's
The
not
only
going to
number
come.
you're never going to hit is the one in
The
that sheet.
only
That's
that's
guaranteed.
that's guaranteed, right? Maybe you'll do better, maybe you'll do worse.
But you're not
I'm
doing
not
that
saying
number.
one, but you're not doing that number, right? So you can spend a lot of time on it. The true value of a financial model is really two things, in my opinion. One is what you already mentioned, which is the scenario planning, right? If we do X, Y is the likely result. If we do Z, then double Z is a likely result. So being able to have a model that's flexible to do that scenario planning, not just today, but quarterly, annually, what's changed in the last year so that we can update the model and it's flexible enough to give us accurate or somewhat accurate directional projections. So that's number one. And then the other thing that is very, very important, in my opinion, out of a financial model is the establishment of goals, right? So if you have a strategy and you say, this is our strategy and we want to accomplish X, Y, and Z this year, what you can do is you can align the financial model to the execution of that strategy and come out of it with interim goals. I always say revenue is a byproduct of strategic execution, right? You shouldn't allow that revenue line in your financial model. That's not a strategy, but you can establish revenue goals to tell if you're if you're in line for the execution of that strategy and the accomplishment of your annual goals by those interim milestones that come out of it. So they're a byproduct of your strategic execution. They're not a driver of your strategic execution.
Yeah, understood. Look, this has been great. Let me just give you an opportunity is there anything else you want to share with our audience about the industry, about your services, about best practices and finance ops, anything you'd like to share as we close out today?
I think, there are a lot of really good consultants in the industry, and I'll look for those connections, right? Whether it's finance and HR, like what we do, or legal and insurance, or any of those other components, and you can typically find somebody that meets your cultural need and meets your development need. And those things, again, back to what we talked about a little bit earlier, allow you and your executive team to then go execute on what's really important, which is driving the growth of the company and driving the success of the company. Take those day-to-day administrative tasks off your plate, make sure they get done, really well, which is what we do and what we focus on. Our work quality is top of the industry, in my opinion. Make sure they get done really well. But it also allows you to then go and do what you are best at, which is growing the company and running a successful company.
Good stuff. Understood. Well, look, thank you for spending time with us today. It's really insightful. And to our audience, again, we're lucky to have such an insightful guest. Our alliance partner, Waterton, John Ripley, good stuff. Great, and we're so happy you were here today. To learn more about Waterton, please visit their website, www.watertonpartners.com, right?
Yep.
Learn more
right.
specifically about his team and a little bit more detail about the services. And to learn more about the Arcview Group, please visit our website, www.arcviewgroup.com. And again, when you go there, go to events, sign up for our great October event. We're looking forward to seeing you there. It's going to be fantastic. So great. So look, again, thank you, John. And thank you to all of our audience viewers. I really hope you hope you enjoyed today's program. I certainly did. And have a great weekend and end of summer. Thank you all very much.
Thanks a lot, Jeff.